Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. By all means, tell us where you are. I see Michael's calling in from Southern Idaho or viewing from Southern Idaho. Let's get some other comments about where you're from. I'm Catherine Mattice. I'm the founder and CEO of Civility Partners. We focus on building positive work environments. And I have my guest today, Esther Weinberg, and she does some cool stuff. The name of her company is the Ready Zone. And she is a business growth accelerator. She works with executives and companies to create pivots, big impacts and big returns. She was just telling me she was an executive at Disney and has worked with big companies like Netflix, NBC, CNN, Sony. And she's also a member of the Forbes Coaches Council and a contributor to Forbes. So thanks, Esther, for being with me this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. This is exciting. I love we're having a global conversation.
We are. So I would love for all of you who are viewing to please do tell us where you're at and ask questions along the way. We have, a former Disney executive who's helping companies pivot, pivot was like the big word at the beginning of COVID, right? So by all means, ask questions and I will in turn ask them of Esther. So Esther, one of the things that you do at the Ready Zone is you have these kind of six, pardon me, things that people need to be focusing on or organizations should focus on. Can you tell me first a little bit about those 6 things that you see?
Yeah, well, I think we take a step back just for context.
Sure.
So, I think the way that even the genesis of it is that leaders today, you probably find it for yourself. It's like, how do you feel ready to powerfully take on all the opportunities and challenges at your feet? You kind of feel like, I feel like at some point you feel like I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. And sometimes I often find that it feels like like in Brooklyn, they would have these fire hydrants on the ground on the streets, and how we would get cool in the summers, we would take the covers off. And so it would flood us. And so it would flood us with water. And so I think that's how leaders feel today, right? They want to feel powerful, take on all these opportunities and challenges at their feet. But the question really is how, right? It's like a big question, like how do we do it? What makes the most sense? And so what we found is you do so by creating these workplace cultures where trust, respect, and psychological safety are valued, which probably no one would argue with that, right? Sounds good on paper, but there is measured as the bottom line. And so what we've created is a diagnostic formula with these 6 key areas, which I'll explain very clearly so that I can see if I'm doing it as a leader, I can see if I'm doing that with my team, and I can see if I'm doing it as an organization.
Okay.
And so it's a very clear indicator. So to go through them briefly, and it's not, and I want to be clear, it's not like, oh, you're grading up, like, oh, I got this one down, oh, I'm on to the next level. It's not like you're in university. So the 6 zones are called action ready. There's not any order: action ready, influence ready, connect ready, culture ready, impact ready, and pivot ready. Now, let me just explain each of them. Action ready, I really call like the foundation of the house. That's around developing your level of emotional agility. You're even understanding what your legacy is and how you bring that inside the organization. Influence ready is how you develop influence through visibility and alignment while building sustainable relationships, and doing it from the intention of being giving rather than just taking or receiving, or I need visibility because I want to look so fabulous, right?
Right.
Connect ready is how do you have consistency in communication and take responsibility for the impact of your communication? Because as you know, just because words are coming out of your mouth doesn't mean you're actually saying anything. Culture ready, we define it a little differently. We define it as how do you build an organization where people are coaching and mentoring each other to build out the best in everybody. And that's what everyone is around to do. Impact ready is how do you develop and grow powerful teams. And pivot ready, as you so eloquently said when we started this, was the overused word when COVID started. The way we really foundationally say it is, how do you really master resilience and cultivating that consistent mindset of change and resilience inside your organization? So those are the 6 diagnostic areas. And I think they're foundational, like the water you drink.
Yeah, I love that metaphor. And I love how that's what's cool about these types of conversations is we have our own, kind of areas or facets or buckets, whatever you want to call it, of things that we think companies should be focusing on in culture, because we focus specifically on culture. You're doing a lot more than that, but it's always interesting to hear, well, what's your perspective based on your experiences and all of that. So what are some of the big mistakes that organizations tend to make in time of change? And I think we could say, well, we just coming out of a big change, but we're moving into another big change because we're not done yet. So what are some of the mistakes that you're seeing or have seen?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say this, and we talked about it in the answer to your first question, which is that if we believe that one of the biggest mistakes that organizations make is forgetting to create that environment of trust, respect, and psychological safety. I'd say it's almost like taking the eye off the wheel. Change is not one time, it's constant. And it's interesting because the data shows, there was a piece of data that said that if employees trust their employer's commitments, their engagement level can increase for up to 20%. You may say, well, that's not bad. But the likelihood they will leave their organization goes down by 87%.
Wow.
So the data is huge. Now, look, you were saying it, people are experiencing your changes inside the organization on top of 4 tons of other changes. COVID, parenting, political issues, social issues, economic pressure. The psychological impact of that is huge. Ann Maston, who is a great psychologist and professor of child development at the University of Minnesota, called this phenomenon surge capacity. Surge capacity is like our adaptive systems, mental and physical, that we can do in acutely stressful situations like natural disasters. Because you can see there's a tornado, there's a flood, right? But we're in chronic stages of what this is. And what we forget is culture is portable and grief and loss is real. So we have this external calamities like supply chain shortages, inflation, climate change, gun violence, hate crimes. But what about the interior crisis? How can we take our eye off the ball when it comes to us? So that's all a fabric and a part of creating this organization this environment of trust, respect, and psychological safety. So I think that's the biggest need, I say, that I see all over the place that's underlying it all.
I agree. And you said all of that so eloquently, and I feel the same. I mean, I often finish my speeches these days by essentially saying the world is so crazy right now. Let's, if your workplace feels safe and respectful, it can be a safe haven for people, and they will thank you and be so loyal to you because you're safe. Or they're safe there, versus like when they get home, they have to fight with their uncle about political differences or whatever. Like I posted something on Facebook about Roe versus Wade, and some random uncle who's never commented on my post, of course. So, it's funny. So, I definitely agree with you that I think it's an organization's kind of moral responsibility to create a place where people feel good at work, and that involves respect and psychological safety.
Well, I think, and one of the, just to underscore that too, is I think that right now that we have to also teach people how to speak about their emotions, because we have to remember that feelings are a signpost to what's important, and why do we ignore them so much? And as a leader, I hear leaders go, I've heard this much more over the last 2-3 years, like, I'm not a therapist. Like, I'm not asking you to be a therapist. I'm asking you to be a human. So, because it's the underpinning of so many things. So, for example, I was working with an organization and a leader was saying, I hear complaining inside of my marketing team. I'm like, okay, complaining is actually a signpost to what's important to somebody. I'm not going to complain about something I don't care about.
Right.
So how do you actually dive more deeply into it to get underneath it so that you can really deal with the cause, not with the effect?
Right.
Which is critical.
Right. A quick question. Beth is asking, she says, what was the 6? So action, influence, culture, connection, pivot. What was the
Yeah, so I'll go through them. Yeah, I'm sorry. I went through it too fast. Like, I'm so sorry. I went through it too fast. Okay, so it's action ready, influence ready, connect ready, culture ready, impact ready, and pivot ready. Now, of course, there's no mistake that we're called the ready zone, and these are, blank ready. But it's really, and like I said before, is these are the foundations for how do you create that level of readiness for yourself.
Yeah. Thank you for answering that.
Sure.
So back to what you were just saying, I agree with you around emotions and vulnerability at work. And I think one silver lining of COVID was that even they couldn't help but show emotions. Leaders couldn't help but show some more real version of themselves. Some did more than others. But all of a sudden we could see inside our leaders' homes. And I'm thinking of one client in particular that really operates in a very formal, hierarchical way. And to see those very formally, these people communicate very formally. They don't show emotions. In fact, their culture is like, suck it up, buttercup, make it happen. To just kind of have a little bit of vulnerability through that. And I say that too. I'm talking to HR. Those are my people. And I talk about, you want people to tell you about harassment if it happens, or sexual harassment, but they're not going to tell you if they don't feel like it's okay to be vulnerable, because that's a very vulnerable place to be. Or if somebody needs help because they're too stressed out, they're struggling at home and they can't meet a deadline, they're not going to tell you about if it's not okay to be vulnerable. And work has this weird thing where you're supposed to talk about KPIs and objectives and, every goals, and it's all so measurable. And it's like naturally work doesn't leave room for vulnerability, and we've got to continue to move out of that. Yes, we need to measure all that stuff, but we can also judge how well our company's doing based on how vulnerable people are. It's a good thing if people are vulnerable. So anyway, just agreeing with you.
Well, it's interesting because to dovetail off of what you're saying too, because when you think about, the age-old question is what creates sustainable change, right? Like it's the age-old question, what really creates it? And I would really say that, going back to the word that we were talking about, is we can't control change, right? I mean, we saw that when COVID hit. Even how you hug your grandmother changed. But what we can control is our actions and our intentions. Mm-hmm. So anyone can shift for a singular moment and in a moment. And think of it, the sum of all those small shifts lead to massive ones. It's like you don't realize how far you've come till you turn around and look in the rearview mirror, right?
Yeah.
Taking those moment by moment steps is what I call pivot moments. They're these moments that build up resilience and give us evidence and proof that I can change, you can change, we all can change and have the strength to continue. And how you actually, what's the sum of it, if you think about it almost like a formula of it. And I encourage people, like, if you just adopt this for yourself, it can become what I call like a back of the napkin thing. Like, I can write on the back of the napkin. I'm doing this, but pivot moments is made of looking at what your current reality is.
Yeah.
That comes about how you feel about something, your emotions, how you experience the change, or the actions or inactions that you're taking to support the changes or not. Because if you're really honest with yourself, sometimes you can see is what I'm doing really a match for what my intention is? You could probably relate to this, Catherine, with all your clients, right? Is that, and I'll give you a real tangible example so it doesn't sound so ephemeral. So one of my clients, Aisha, she was gotten so frustrated with her boss, Jamila, who is the president of a division at an entertainment company. And she's got really frustrated because she feels like Jamila can't make decisions. She vacillates, or she makes a decision, she goes back on it, and she can't handle conflict. Mm-hmm. It's like, so kind of the opposite of the work that you do. So Aisha is really seen as the number 2 person, like the heir apparent in the department. So what Aisha does is that she steps in, starts making decisions where she shouldn't, or she pushes to be more strategic out of sheer frustration, or she looks to manage one of her peers who is someone who also can't make decisions. And you can imagine for someone who's type A, high performer, so frustrating. But when I talked to her, I said, what are your emotions? And she's like, look, I'm really angry. I'm frustrated. I'm disappointed. I'm afraid. But what we really got to is that she's heartbroken. Her experience about her boss, which I'll go into in a second, her experience about her boss, she doesn't know how to lead. Her lack of decision-making is going to get us into trouble, which it did at some point. She isn't strategic. She leads with this crazy ego. But when we talked about the actions that she's doing, because I said, okay, what actions do you do to really match your intention of managing up with greater ease, being a great collaborator? She's like, all right, well, if I had to really admit it, I'm stepping in to make decisions that wasn't appropriate. When it came time to present a reorg plan to my boss with my peer, I actually did it. I wasn't telling my boss, and she was also thinking about leaving. But then when we looked at where she could pivot, and that's what I call possibility, so current reality possibility, she could see something for what it is, not what she preferred. And she realized she didn't speak up. She was tolerating until this became intolerable. And by realizing what's happening, she really put herself in the driver's seat. And I call that your opportunity. So then she could really talk about practically and pragmatically what she can stop and start doing to create a new outcome. So if you have current reality, possibility, opportunity, it can create a whole new pathway for you to look, because sometimes it can feel so overwhelming when you're in it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Coaching is so interesting too, because we all have our own methods. In my coaching with my kind of toxic leaders, we talk a lot about fight or flight.
Yeah.
And so that's what I hear when you're talking, is that the person you're coaching is engaging in fight. She's like doing things around, to get around the boss. She's, angry inside. So there's a little bit of fight there. And so she, is acting in ways that are more instinctual, and you were able to pull her out of that and say, well, let's really look at what's happening and how you can address it. So we have some comments here, so I'm going to read them here. So saw many Bloomberg interviews with executives during COVID and saw them emote often. I got a sense that they were uncertain about the future of their company, their pertaining business sector. I came away from those interviews that they were humans, feelings, emotions. So yeah, absolutely. A different Michael, another Michael says, Catherine is raising vulnerability-based trust as a first step to trust, and work is a place like family. Yes, indeed. And hi, Michael. I know that Michael who's commenting on that. So how can leaders help their teams, or what do they need to be doing to kind of create sustainable change, help their teams build resilience through that change? Can you give us a tip or two on what a leader needs to be doing in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, some things may sound very simplistic. So one thing is to honor your word. I can't tell you how many people will say things like, no meetings after 5 o'clock, no meetings between 1 and 2. And then all of a sudden there's a meeting, there's a something. And so that in a sense, when you don't honor your word, it instantly erodes your credibility and also creates a place of lack of safety for people. They don't really know where to go and what to do.
Right.
And I would also say there's a lot of conversation today about self-care. And here's what I'll say about self-care. Lighting candle in a bath doesn't work for everybody. Okay. And I don't mean to,
I laugh. It definitely doesn't work for me.
Yeah. So I've had days I've laid on the floor of my office and breathed for 5 minutes because my capacity to take anything in has been I'm out. I mean, I'm just completely out. I'm blown, as Brene Brown would say. So I would also say you have to, like what someone was saying, is be human too. You have to show how we feel, and it's a signpost. The other thing too that we have to remember today is what's distinct today is that there's more of an awareness, is that we're communication and connection. It can also be a minefield today because of race, politics. There's so many issues on people's mind. And so we have to, I would say that conversations people struggle with are even more so now that we're in a virtual environment.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to say the wrong thing. Like I remember I will say I'm gay. And even my poor mother, who I love with all my soul, said to me, "Oh, you'd love my doctor." And I said, "Why?" She's like, "Oh, she's gay too." Like, oh, you do understand how insulting that is?
Yeah.
So it's we can't talk about how to create resiliency and not talk about diversity as part of the equation, and how to actually speak into conversations with people of all different ethnicities and diversities, not just of race, color, creed, but also where people are located, and they have different ways of looking at the world. It's almost like I always say, as a leader, what we're managing is people's lenses and how they view the world. And so you have to be careful of a few things. It's great so first of all, it's also important that you discuss with senior leaders of influence what you can do together to elevate voices of folks, marginalized communities, or people who have different perspectives, and also to ensure you're on the right track. We have to make sure, like I have clients who are at companies that made investments that in let's say in Florida, when they came out with the Don't Say Gay bill, that all of a sudden it was like egg on their face because you looked like, wait a second, you're not actually honoring your word. That's probably an extreme example. It's also important to admit when you're misstepped and we're wrong and correct your actions immediately, because the moment you step over your word, people will never trust you again.
Right.
So you have to hold the space for folks who are different, have different points of view, and to be able to get underneath about why people are thinking the way they do. Inquiry, not why, but what are people are thinking, and how are they thinking? Because inquiry is even more of a powerful skill today, because we're so apt to come from judgment because of our own cognitive blindnesses. And so how do we expand that awareness? So I know I gave you a lot, but I would say those are some of the key things that don't often get talked about enough too.
Yeah, that was a lot, and that's a lot to take in. You said something specifically around, conversations about race and political stuff, and there's a lot of unrest for all sorts of reasons right now, and hybrid work. And so we know that a conversation like this over Zoom, it's harder to build a relationship. How can we have a real conversation around something that we maybe both care a lot about over Zoom? And so, we're missing a lot of the body language and things and the ability to connect. So I'm curious, do you have thoughts on how to be a leader in this scenario where people may want to talk about how they're feeling about something like Roe versus Wade, for example, that just happened? And how do they do that with a hybrid workforce? And then we have some other questions, I think, from the people watching.
I'll give you a great example. When there was, for those of you, because I know we have a global audience here, but there was a mass shooting in a school in Uvalde, Texas, a few weeks ago. And for those of you in America, you know that gun violence has been prevalent. I'm not going to get into the politics of it, but you know that gun violence is prevalent. For those of you around the world may not know, but gun violence in the United States is very prevalent. And there was a leader who was telling me a story about how her team got together and they started talking about the business of the day. And then one woman who looked so upset, the executive said, I'd be really, you look like you're really out of sorts a bit, and it's unusual for you to look as off as you do. And I know I'm just seeing you on a camera, but how are you? Are you okay? And she wasn't even thinking about the shooting. And because the woman opened the door, her employee said, look, it's really hard for me to focus today because of the shooting. And all of a sudden, the leader said, she stopped the meeting and said, you know what? We're going to talk about this right now. I know we're supposed to talk about other business, but I'm going to stop right now. We're going to talk about this for the duration of our meeting. I want to know how you're all feeling. And there were two men who were sharing that they had dropped off their kids at school that morning, and they were so afraid. And one man started to cry because how fearful he was to bring his kids. And so that kind of reading, I thought it was so smart that she read the room, and then she got really curiously engaged and was able to say, smart enough to say, I'm going to suspend the business for the moment because the business, if you think about it, the business couldn't continue because they are so consumed with this in their minds.
Yep.
And so that in itself is a small, but can you imagine how they'll remember that conversation?
Right. That's a great example, a really great example. We've done some blog posts recently on training with psychological safety in mind, and I know our trainer Tony Herndon talked about that. A similar story of just like someone might say something that's offensive, or and instead of trying to kind of brush it under the rug, like, well, we got material to cover. It's a good teachable moment to say, well, let's talk about that for a moment. How do people feel about that comment? And we're not accosting the person, we're just hearing what people say. And I think that's a great example. I hadn't never even made the connection that it could also be for a business meeting. So thank you for that aha moment.
But, I appreciate that. Well, I would say also is that what a leader could also do in that moment is say, thank you so much for for hearing that one woman, pausing and say, I would really like to have this conversation. Would you all be open to it? So almost like creating the invitation, and what would we need? What kind of space would we need to create in order for us to feel like we can have that conversation together?
Yep.
That would
and
be
people aren't going to open up if they feel like they're not psychologically safe, or being vulnerable is not okay. And so then we're back to things like company culture. Okay, let's see. Michael's asking a question. He says, discuss pivot moments that scare people today, up 78% from a year ago. Tech IA changing jobs or eliminating routine jobs or tasks that diminish value of contact center or customer care. Michael, I feel like you have to elaborate for us a little bit.
Yes, please.
Yeah. But maybe that first part, I just discussed pivot moments that scare people today. Maybe you have some insight on just kind of the most scary types of pivots that organizations or leaders have to make.
Well, look, I'll tell you, like, I have a client now who's the head of a massive division, whose their whole company has been acquired. There's been so many people. Originally, when the company came in to acquire them, they said there's not going to be massive changes, especially within the area that he works. And so, because the company that acquired them really didn't have expertise in that area. Well, of course, the way that it worked is that that's not true. And so, including his boss got let go, and a bunch of other people got let go. And now he's in a situation where he just started at the company about a year ago. And he was really careful when he started not to make massive changes for legacy people that were there. Because, and I will say that the culture was a very entitled culture, but he came in not that at all, the most humble, egoless person on the planet. And so really changed the fabric of the culture, but there's still that within the organization that he's going to need to start making more critical decisions. So I think people are just waiting because the shoe is dropped in so many places. Like, what would it be? And I'm sure if he does decide to start letting people go, which he frankly may need to, because of skills and capabilities that are not a match now for what the organization needs, it's going to frighten him to death.
Right.
And so how he handles that with dignity is going to be critical. And I think that's one of those conversations where people talk about, when companies merge, there's organic layoffs. But what about the times when where the culture is and the skill set is not a match for the people who've been there a long time, and they're not willing to up level. And at a certain point, you are going to need to make certain changes with dignity. And that will frighten the hell out of people, because I'm sure they're going to be thinking, when's the other shoe going to drop if he has to do that? So I think that would scare the bejesus out of people too.
Yeah. And actually, that's a risk factor for toxic behavior, because as people start to feel threatened, fight or flight, they start engaging in kind of competitive, aggressive behavior. A lot of it has to do with just burnout. The more burned out we are, the less energy we have to be civil, because we're focused on ourselves. And high competition for something like a job or not being laid off is can cause the risk factor. It's just so much going on right now, and I really appreciate Esther. I feel like we could talk for another 3 hours. And we've got some people from Romania. I saw somebody else coming from somewhere else. By all means, you know where to find Esther. You can locate her on LinkedIn, and she can respond to any additional questions you have.
Yes.
Her website is thereadyzone.com. And I'm so glad to have met you and had this conversation, Esther. And everyone, have a great morning, afternoon, or evening.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you.